If you've ever wandered through Florence, perhaps you remember the way the light falls on terracotta rooftops in the late afternoon. The great dome of the cathedral rising against the Tuscan sky, the Arno flowing quietly beneath ancient stone bridges, and everywhere, if you look closely, you'll notice a curious symbol repeated on buildings and churches and palace walls. 6 balls arranged in a pattern, sometimes gilded, sometimes carved in stone. This is the coat of arms of the Medici, a family of bankers who transformed this city and changed the course of Western civilization. Tonight, we'll trace their remarkable story. We'll follow a family from modest origins as they built a financial empire, befriended popes, and funded the artistic flowering we call the Renaissance. There's no need to follow every detail. Let the story wash over you like light through a Florentine window, so settle in, let your breathing slow, and drift with us through the sleepy history of the Medici Bank. About 30 miles north of Florence, nestled among the gentle hills of Tuscany, lies a valley called the Mugello. It is a quiet landscape even today, a place of chestnut forests and olive groves, of small villages and farms that seem to have changed little over the centuries. The hills roll softly toward the Apennine Mountains in the distance. In autumn, the forests turn golden. In spring, wildflowers dot the meadows. This was the ancestral homeland of the Medici family. Long before they became bankers and statesmen, before their name became synonymous with wealth and power, the Medici were simply people of this valley. Farmers, perhaps. Minor landowners. The kind of family that might pass through history without leaving a trace. The name itself, Medici, has puzzled historians. It means doctors, or medical men in Italian, and some have speculated that the family's distant ancestors were physicians or apothecaries. Others suggest a connection to the guild of doctors and pharmacists, though the Medici we know were merchants and bankers, not healers. These 6 balls on their coat of arms have inspired their own theories, some claiming they represent pills or cupping glasses from a medical past. But truthfully, we don't know. The origins are lost in the mist of medieval obscurity, and perhaps that's fitting for a family that would reinvent itself so thoroughly. What we do know is that sometime in the 12th or 13th century, members of the Medici family began appearing in Florence. They came down from the Mugello Valley, as so many ambitious families did, drawn by the opportunities of the growing city. Florence in those centuries was becoming one of the great commercial centres of Europe, a place where fortunes could be made by those with skill and determination. To understand what the Medici found when they arrived, we need to picture Florence as it was in the High Middle Ages. By the late 13th century, it had grown into a substantial city, home to perhaps 100,000 people. This made it one of the largest cities in Europe, comparable to Venice or Milan, larger than London or Paris at the time. The city spilled beyond its ancient Roman walls, spreading along both banks of the Arno River. Florence's prosperity rested on 2 foundations. The first was wool. Florentine merchants had developed a remarkable industry, importing raw wool from England and Spain, processing it through dozens of specialized steps, and producing finished cloth of exceptional quality. This cloth was exported throughout Europe and the Mediterranean, bringing wealth flowing back to the city. The great guild of wool merchants, the Arte della Lana, was one of the most powerful organizations in Florence, its members among the city's leading citizens. The second foundation was banking. Florence had become one of the financial capitals of medieval Europe. its bankers lending money to popes and kings, financing trade across vast distances, developing sophisticated techniques for moving wealth without physically transporting heavy coins. The gold florin, first minted in Florence in 1252, had become one of the most trusted currencies in the world. Wherever merchants gathered from London to Constantinople, florins changed hands, their consistent gold content making them reliable in a world of debased and uncertain coinages. These two industries, wool and banking, were closely intertwined. The wool trade required vast amounts of capital to finance the months between purchasing raw materials and selling finished cloth. It required mechanisms for transferring money across borders, for extending credit, for managing the risks of long-distance commerce. The bankers provided these services, and many banking families were also involved in the wool trade. The line between merchant and banker was blurry, and the most successful families operated on both sides. Florence organized its economic life through guilds, associations of merchants and craftsmen that regulated their respective trades. The major guilds, known as the Arti Maggiori, held political power in the city. The Arte del Cambio, the Guild of Bankers and Money Changers, was one of these elite organizations. To operate as a banker in Florence, you needed to be a member of this guild, subject to its rules and entitled to its privileges. The early Medici were not among Florence's great families. They appear in records as modest merchants, working their way up through the guild system, accumulating small properties, occasionally holding minor civic offices. They were respectable but unremarkable, one family among many striving to improve their position in a competitive city. And then, in the middle of the 14th century, catastrophe struck. The Black Death arrived in Florence in the spring of 1348. It came on ships from the east, carried by fleas on rats, though no one at the time understood the mechanism of transmission. What they understood was that people were dying, quickly and horribly, in numbers that defied comprehension. The plague killed perhaps half of Florence's population within a matter of months. Some estimates suggest the death toll was even higher. The great chronicler Giovanni Villani was among the victims, his chronicle breaking off mid-sentence as death took him. The writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived, set his famous Decameron against the backdrop of the plague, describing young Florentines fleeing to the countryside to escape the dying city. The economic disruption was profound. Labour became scarce, driving up wages for those who survived. Businesses failed as their owners died or their customers vanished. Debts went unpaid. Trade routes that had connected Florence to distant markets were disrupted by the plague's spread across Europe. But the plague was not the only disaster to shake Florentine finance in these years. Even before the Black Death arrived, the city's greatest banking houses had suffered a catastrophic blow. The Bardi and Peruzzi families had built two of the largest banks in Europe. Their operations spanned the continent, with branches in London, Paris, Naples, and beyond. They had become the primary bankers to the English crown, lending enormous sums to King Edward III to finance his wars against France. Royal loans were prestigious and potentially profitable. A king could offer valuable privileges and concessions in exchange for credit. But royal loans were also dangerous because kings were difficult to sue if they decided not to repay. In the early 1340s, Edward III decided not to repay. The exact circumstances are complex and disputed, but the result was clear. The English crown defaulted on debts totalling perhaps 1.5 million gold florins, an almost inconceivable sum. The Bardi and Peruzzi banks collapsed, unable to meet their own obligations when their greatest asset, the English royal debt, proved worthless. The failure sent shockwaves through the Florentine economy. Other banks that had lent to the Bardi and Peruzzi failed in turn. Depositors lost their savings. Merchants lost access to the credit they needed to conduct their businesses. Combined with the plague that followed a few years later, the 1340s were a period of profound disruption for Florence. Yet disruption creates opportunity. The great banking houses were gone, but the need for banking services remained. Popes still needed to collect tithes from across Christendom. Merchants still needed to transfer money and extend credit. The gap left by the Bardi and Peruzzi created space for new families to rise. Among those families were the Medici. In the decades after the Black Death, various members of the family engaged in banking and trade with varying degrees of success. They were building experience, accumulating modest capital, learning the business. A man named Averardo de' Medici, known as Bici, established himself as a successful banker in the later 14th century. His son would take what Averardo built and transform it into something much greater. But we should not rush ahead. The story of the Medici Bank is a story of patience, of careful building over generations. The foundations matter. The slow accumulation of knowledge and capital and reputation, the lessons learned from observing what destroyed the great banks of the past, these would shape everything that followed. The lesson of the Bardi and Peruzzi was clear, even if it would sometimes be forgotten. Lending to kings was dangerous. They had the power to simply refuse repayment, and there was little a banker could do about it. The most powerful borrowers were often the least reliable. This was a lesson the Medici would remember, at least for a time. Florence in the late 14th century was recovering slowly from its disasters. The population remained far below its pre-plague peak, but trade was reviving. New fortunes were being made. The city's political system, a complex arrangement of guilds and councils and shifting factions, offered opportunities for ambitious families to rise. Into this world around 1360, a child was born to Averardo de' Medici and his wife Jacopa. They named him Giovanni. He was not the eldest son, not the heir to what modest family fortune existed. He would have to make his own way in the world. Giovanni di Bici de' Medici would grow up to become the true founder of the Medici banking dynasty. The choices he made, the relationships he built, the principles he established would create the foundation for everything that followed. His son Cosimo would expand the enterprise into an empire. His great-grandson Lorenzo would become the most famous Medici of all. But without Giovanni's patient work, none of it would have been possible. The path from the Mugello Valley to the heights of European finance was neither straight nor guaranteed. It required skill and luck, patience and ambition, an ability to learn from the failures of others and avoid their mistakes. Giovanni de' Bici would prove to have all of these qualities and something more. He had a genius for banking that would change his family's fortunes forever. But on the day of his birth, in a modest Florentine house, none of this was foreseeable. He was simply another child in a city still recovering from catastrophe, a city where the great banking families had fallen and new ones had not yet risen to take their place. The opportunity was there, waiting. The question was whether anyone would seize it. Giovanni di Bici de' Medici came into the world around 1360, though we cannot be certain of the exact year. Medieval birth records were not kept with the precision we expect today, and for a family that had not yet risen to prominence, such details often went unrecorded. What we know is that he was born into a Florence still recovering from the devastations of the Black Death, into a family of modest means and uncertain prospects. He was not the eldest son. This simple fact shaped his early life in ways that would prove significant. In medieval Florence, as in most of Europe, the eldest son typically inherited the bulk of the family's property and position. Younger sons had to find their own way, entering the church or the military, or, if they were fortunate, learning a trade that might allow them to prosper independently. For Giovanni, the path forward lay in banking. Whether this was his own choice or simply the opportunity that presented itself, we cannot say, but at some point in his youth he went to work for a relative named Vieri di Cambio de' Medici, who operated a successful banking business in Florence. Vieri was one of the more prosperous members of the extended Medici clan in this period. His bank was not among the giants of Florentine finance, but it was solid and respectable, conducting business across Italy and maintaining connections with the papal court in Rome. For a young man seeking to learn the banking trade, it was an excellent place to start. We can imagine Giovanni in those early years, working as a junior clerk in Vieri's establishment. He would have learned to keep the careful records that banking required, the ledgers filled with debits and credits that tracked every transaction. He would have learned to evaluate the creditworthiness of borrowers, to calculate exchange rates between different currencies, to draft the bills of exchange that allowed money to move across borders without the physical transport of coins. Banking in 14th century Florence was not a simple business. It required literacy and numeracy at a level that most people did not possess. It required knowledge of foreign currencies and exchange rates, of the creditworthiness of merchants and nobles across Europe, of the complex web of relationships that connected the financial centres of the medieval world. A successful banker needed to be part accountant, part diplomat, part intelligence analyst. Giovanni proved adept at all of this. His rise through Vieri's organisation was steady, and eventually he was entrusted with a position of considerable responsibility. Vieri sent him to Rome to manage the bank's operations in the papal city. This assignment would prove to be the most important of Giovanni's life. Rome in the late 14th century was the seat of the papacy, the spiritual centre of Western Christendom, and one of the most important financial hubs in the world. The wealth that flowed through the papal court was staggering. Tithes and taxes arrived from every corner of Catholic Europe. Fees were paid for dispensations, appointments, indulgences. The business of the church required constant movement of money, and that movement required bankers. The papal court needed reliable financial partners who could collect revenues in distant lands and transfer them safely to Rome. They needed bankers who could extend credit when revenues ran short and papal expenses pressed. They needed discretion, competence, and above all trustworthiness. The relationship between a pope and his bankers was intimate and consequential. Giovanni learned this business thoroughly during his years in Rome. He built relationships with officials in the papal court, demonstrating his reliability and skill. He came to understand the rhythms of church finance, the timing of revenues and expenditures, the opportunities and risks that papal banking presented. By the early 1390s, Giovanni had accumulated enough capital and experience to consider striking out on his own. Vieri di Cambio was aging, and it was becoming clear that he would not continue in business indefinitely. Giovanni saw an opportunity to establish his own independent operation. In 1397, Giovanni de' Medici formally established his own bank in Florence. This is the date traditionally given for the founding of the Medici Bank, though in truth the enterprise grew gradually from Giovanni's earlier work. He was around 37 years old, neither young nor old for such an undertaking. He had spent roughly 2 decades learning his trade. The initial capital was modest by the standards of great banking houses. Giovanni contributed perhaps 10,000 florins of his own money, supplementing this with investments from partners. The sum was respectable, but not enormous. Many banks operated with similar capitalization. What would distinguish the Medici Bank was not the size of its initial capital, but the skill with which that capital was employed. Giovanni's master stroke was maintaining and expanding the Rome connection. While he established his headquarters in Florence, as any respectable Florentine banker would, he ensured that the Rome branch remained the heart of his operation. The papal business that he had cultivated during his years working for Vieri continued under his own banner, and he worked assiduously to expand it. The papal account would become the crown jewel of Medici banking for decades to come. It was not just profitable in itself, though it certainly was that. It also provided prestige and credibility that benefited all the bank's other operations. A banker trusted by the Pope was a banker who could be trusted by anyone. Giovanni organized his enterprise using a legal structure known as the accomandita, or limited partnership. This was an arrangement in which some partners contributed capital but had limited involvement in day-to-day management, while other partners, typically including the senior Medici, took more active roles and bore greater responsibility. The beauty of this structure was that it limited liability. If a branch of the bank failed, the losses would be contained to that branch's capital rather than threatening the entire family fortune. This was a lesson learned from the disasters that had befallen earlier banking houses. The Bardi and Peruzzi had been structured in ways that allowed failures in one area to cascade through the entire organisation. When their English loans went bad, everything collapsed. Giovanni was determined to avoid this fate. Each branch of his growing network would be organised as a separate partnership, with its own capital and its own books. Losses in one place would not automatically destroy operations elsewhere. The system also created incentives for the managers of individual branches. These branch managers were not merely employees drawing a salary. They were partners with a stake in their branch's success. If the branch prospered, they prospered. If it failed through their mismanagement, they suffered along with the senior partners in Florence. This alignment of interests encouraged careful, responsible banking. Giovanni's character was well suited to the business he was building. He was not flamboyant or showy. He did not seek attention or engage in conspicuous displays of wealth. Contemporary descriptions suggest a man who was careful, methodical, even somewhat reserved. He built his bank's reputation on reliability rather than flash. This extended to his political behaviour as well. Florence in the early 15th century was a republic, though one in which wealthy families competed constantly for influence and power. The political arena was dangerous. Factions rose and fell, and families that overreached could find themselves exiled, their property confiscated, their carefully built fortunes destroyed overnight. Giovanni navigated these waters with great caution. He held some civic offices, as was expected of a prosperous citizen, but he did not seek prominent positions or attempt to dominate the political scene. He built relationships with powerful families but avoided becoming identified too closely with any faction. he was helpful to those in power without appearing to grasp for power himself. This restraint was deliberate. Giovanni understood that a banker's greatest assets were trust and reputation, and both could be damaged by political entanglements. He wanted to be seen as a reliable partner for anyone who needed banking services, regardless of their political allegiances. A banker too closely identified with one faction would lose the business of their opponents. As the years passed, Giovanni's bank grew steadily. Beyond Rome and Florence, he established or acquired interests in other important commercial centres. Venice, the great maritime republic that dominated trade with the East, became home to a Medici branch. The bank's wool and silk trading operations expanded alongside its purely financial business. Giovanni was not merely a banker but a merchant, and the combination of activities reinforced each other. By the 1420s, the Medici Bank had become one of the most important financial institutions in Florence, though not yet the dominant force it would later become. Giovanni himself was recognized as a leading citizen, respected for his wealth and judgment. He served on important civic committees and was consulted on matters of public finance, but he never forgot the dangers of prominence. The advice that Giovanni gave to his sons has come down to us through the centuries, repeated by later generations of Medici and recorded by historians. "Stay out of the public eye," he reportedly counselled. "Never go against the will of the people unless it is something truly harmful being proposed. Don't give advice unless you are asked, and even then, give your opinion calmly and considerately." This was the wisdom of a man who had watched other families rise and fall, who had seen how political prominence could attract the envy and hostility that destroyed fortunes. Giovanni wanted his sons to inherit not just his bank, but his understanding of how to preserve what they had been given. Giovanni de' Medici died in February of 1429. He was approximately 69 years old, a good age for the time. He died in his bed at peace with his affairs in order. This may seem unremarkable, but in the turbulent world of 15th century Italy, to die peacefully of old age was an achievement in itself. He left behind a thriving enterprise. The Medici Bank had capital of perhaps 100,000 florins, a tenfold increase from its founding 3 decades earlier. More importantly, he left behind a system, a set of relationships with the papal court and other clients, a network of branches and partners, and a reputation for integrity that his successors could build upon. He also left 2 sons. The elder was Cosimo, who at the time of his father's death was nearly 40 years old, a mature man who'd been involved in the family business for decades. The younger was Lorenzo, who would manage the Rome branch and prove a capable partner to his brother. Together, they would take what Giovanni had built and transform it into something even greater. Giovanni's legacy was not measured in the buildings he constructed or the art he commissioned, though he did support the reconstruction of San Lorenzo, the family's parish church in Florence. His legacy was measured in the institution he created and the principles he instilled. The quiet virtues of patience, prudence, reliability and discretion that had guided his own career would continue to serve the Medici for another generation. In some ways, Giovanni de' Medici is overshadowed in memory by his more famous descendants. Cosimo would become the unofficial ruler of Florence, patron of artists and scholars, one of the most powerful men in Italy. Lorenzo would be called the Magnificent, his court a glittering centre of Renaissance culture. Compared to these figures, Giovanni can seem almost colourless, a mere precursor to the main event. But this would be a mistake. Great fortunes are not built overnight, and the Medici Bank did not spring fully formed from nothing. It was constructed carefully over decades by a man who understood that lasting success required solid foundations. The Rome connection that Giovanni established would remain profitable for generations. The partnership structure he developed would protect the family from catastrophic losses. The reputation for integrity he cultivated would open doors that remained closed to lesser bankers. Without Giovanni, there would have been no Cosimo, no Lorenzo, no Medici popes or queens. The art and architecture that we associate with the family name would never have been commissioned. The Renaissance itself might have unfolded differently without the Medici fortune to support it. All of this began with a younger son from a modest family, a young man who went to work in his relative's bank and learned his trade patiently, who recognized the opportunity that papal banking presented and cultivated it carefully, who built his business slowly and cautiously over decades. Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici was the quiet founder, and his quiet virtues made everything else possible. The relationship between the Medici Bank and the papal court was the engine that drove everything else. To understand how the Medici became so powerful, we must understand what it meant to be bankers to the Pope, and why this business was so extraordinarily valuable. The papacy in the 15th century was not merely a spiritual institution. It was also one of the largest and most complex financial operations in the medieval world. The Pope was the head of the Catholic Church, which meant he presided over an organization that stretched across all of Western Europe and beyond. From Portugal to Poland, from Scotland to Sicily, the Church collected revenues and incurred expenses on a scale that dwarfed most secular governments. Consider for a moment the sources of papal income. There were the tithes, the traditional tax of 1/10 of income that Christians were expected to contribute to the Church. There were annats, the fees paid by newly appointed bishops and abbots, often equivalent to a full year's income from their new positions. There were fees for dispensations, the special permissions required to do things that church law normally prohibited, such as marrying a close relative or holding multiple church offices simultaneously. There were payments from pilgrims seeking indulgences, documents that promised reduction of time in purgatory. There were rents from the extensive lands that the Church owned across Europe. All of this money had to be collected in dozens of countries, in dozens of different currencies, and somehow brought to Rome. The logistics were daunting. Physical transport of coins was dangerous, expensive, and slow. A shipment of gold travelling from England to Italy might take months and could easily be lost to bandits, shipwreck, or dishonest carriers. The Church needed a better way. This is where bankers came in. A banking network with branches or correspondents across Europe could collect money locally and transfer it to Rome through the magic of accounting rather than the hazard of physical transport. A payment made in London florins could appear in Rome as an entry in a ledger, without any actual coins making the journey. The mechanism that made this possible was the bill of exchange, one of the most important financial innovations of the medieval period. A bill of exchange was essentially a written instruction to pay a specific sum to a specific person in a specific place, usually in a different currency. It allowed money to move across borders safely and efficiently. Here is how it might work in practice. Imagine that the papal collector in England has gathered 10,000 florins worth of church revenues. He needs to get this money to Rome. He goes to the local branch of a banking house, let us say the Medici Bank in London, and deposits his English money. In exchange, he received a bill of exchange. a document instructing the Medici Bank in Rome to pay the equivalent amount to the papal treasury. The collector, or his representative, travels to Rome carrying only a piece of paper. When he presents this paper to the Medici Bank in Rome, they pay out the appropriate sum in local currency. The money has effectively travelled from England to Italy without any physical gold making the journey. The banking house profits from this service in several ways. They charge a fee for the transaction. More importantly, they profit from the exchange rate. The rate at which they convert English money to Roman money is slightly more favourable to themselves than the true market rate. This difference, known as the spread or margin, might seem small on any individual transaction, but across thousands of transactions it added up to substantial sums. Here we must pause to address a delicate matter. The Catholic Church, whose finances the Medici were managing, officially prohibited the lending of money at interest. This prohibition against usury was taken seriously in medieval Europe. Lending money and charging interest was considered sinful, a form of exploitation that placed an unfair burden on those in need. This created an obvious problem for bankers. Banking, at its core, involves providing financial services in exchange for compensation. If you could not charge for lending money, how could you operate a bank profitably? Medieval bankers developed various creative solutions to this dilemma. The bill of exchange was one such solution. Technically, a bill of exchange was not a loan. It was a payment in one place and currency in exchange for a payment in another place and currency. The profit that bankers earned came from currency exchange, not from interest on a loan. This distinction might seem like splitting hairs, and perhaps it was, but it satisfied the theologians, or at least most of them, and it allowed banking to flourish within a Christian framework. Another mechanism was known as discretio, a Latin word meaning discretion or judgment. When a banker provided services to the church might make a voluntary gift in recognition of those services. This gift was not interest, because it was not required or specified in advance. It was simply a token of gratitude, freely given. That the gift happened to be proportional to the services rendered and the capital employed was, officially at least, a coincidence. The Medici were masters of these arrangements. They understood how to structure transactions in ways that were profitable for themselves while remaining acceptable to church authorities. This was not mere hypocrisy or deception. The church genuinely needed banking services, and bankers genuinely needed to be compensated for providing them. The various workarounds allowed both parties to meet their needs while maintaining the formal prohibition against usury. Giovanni di Bicci had established the Medici relationship with the papal court during his years working in Rome, and had nurtured it carefully after founding his own bank. This relationship deepened significantly during the pontificate of Pope Martin V, who reigned from 1417 to 1431. Martin V was elected pope at the Council of Constance, ending a long and painful period known as the Western Schism, during which multiple men had claimed to be popes simultaneously. The schism has damaged the Church's finances as well as its spiritual authority. Martin V needed reliable bankers to help restore order to papal finances, and the Medici were well positioned to provide this service. During Martin's pontificate, the Medici became one of the primary banking partners of the papal court. They handled a growing share of the money flowing to Rome from across Europe. They extended credit when papal expenses exceeded revenues. They built relationships with officials in the Camera Apostolica, the papal treasury, relationships that would pay dividends for decades. The connection grew even stronger under Pope Eugene IV, who reigned from 1431 to 1447. Eugene faced significant challenges during his papacy, including a contentious council at Basel that questioned papal authority and political turbulence in Italy that forced him to flee Rome for extended periods. Through all of this, the Medici remained loyal supporters, continuing to provide financial services even when the Pope's position seemed precarious. This loyalty was rewarded. By the time of Eugene's death, the Medici has become the dominant bankers to the papal court, handling a larger share of papal business than any of their competitors. The Rome branch of the Medici Bank was by far the most profitable part of their operation, generating returns that dwarfed those of other branches. The profits from papal banking were substantial, but they were not the only benefit. Association with the papacy brought prestige that enhanced the Medici reputation everywhere. A family trusted by the Holy Father was a family that could be trusted by anyone. This prestige opened doors to other business, other clients, other opportunities. The papal connection also provided something less tangible but equally valuable: information. The papal court was one of the great information hubs of medieval Europe. Ambassadors and emissaries from every kingdom brought news and gossip. Church officials knew what was happening in distant lands. A banker with close ties to the papal court had access to intelligence that could inform business decisions across the continent. Of course, the Medici were not the only banking family seeking papal favour. Florence alone produced several other houses that competed for this lucrative business. The Pazzi, the Strozzi, the Albizzi, and others all maintained operations in Rome and cultivated relationships with papal officials. The competition could be fierce, with families undermining each other's reputations and seeking to highlight competitors' failures. Maintaining the papal account required constant attention. Officials had to be cultivated, relationships maintained, services provided promptly and reliably. A single significant failure could open the door for competitors to displace you. The Medici invested heavily in this maintenance, keeping their best people in Rome and ensuring that papal business always received priority. The work itself was demanding. The Rome branch had to manage complex transactions involving multiple currencies and distant locations. They had to keep meticulous records, tracking deposits and withdrawals, debts and credits, exchange rates and fees. They had to correspond constantly with other Medici branches and with independent banks that served as correspondents in places where the Medici had no direct presence. Imagine a typical transaction. A newly appointed bishop in Germany owes annates to Rome. He does not have sufficient cash on hand, so he borrows from a local banker, agreeing to repay from the revenues of his new diocese over the coming years. The local banker in turn has a correspondent relationship with a larger banking network, which ultimately connects to the Medici in Rome. Through a series of bills of exchange and ledger entries, the money moves from Germany to Rome without any physical coins crossing the Alps. The Medici in Rome credit the papal treasury and wait for the corresponding debit to work its way through the system. Each step in this chain involves trust. The bishop trusts that his payment will be properly credited. The local banker trusts that the correspondent will honour the bill of exchange. The Medici trust that they will eventually receive compensation for the funds they have advanced. This web of trust, maintained through reputation and reinforced through repeat transactions, was the invisible infrastructure that made medieval banking possible. The Medici did not take this trust for granted. They understood that their position depended on reliability, on being the banker that everyone knew would honour their commitments. A failure to pay, a delay in transferring funds, a dispute over exchange rates, any of these could damage the reputation that was their most valuable asset. By the middle of the 15th century, the papal account had made the Medici one of the wealthiest families in Europe. The profits flowing from Rome funded their expanding business operations, their political activities in Florence, and increasingly their patronage of art and architecture. The magnificent buildings and artworks that we associate with the Medici name were purchased in large part with money earned from banking for the church. There is a certain irony in this. The church that prohibited usury enriched the bankers who found ways around that prohibition. The institution devoted to spiritual salvation funded one of history's greatest flowerings of worldly beauty. The popes who managed this wealth often came from the same merchant families who provided their banking services and sometimes borrowed from them in turn. But perhaps we should not be too quick to see hypocrisy. The medieval world operated according to different assumptions than our own. The prohibition against usury was an attempt to protect the vulnerable from exploitation, a recognition that lending money could become a tool of oppression. The workarounds that bankers developed were genuinely creative solutions to real problems, and the wealth that flowed through this system, whatever we think of its origins, did produce genuine beauty and genuine learning that has enriched humanity for centuries. The Medici understood better than most how to navigate this complex moral and financial landscape. They served the church faithfully while enriching themselves handsomely. They maintained the forms of religious propriety while pursuing worldly success with single-minded determination. They were, in their way, as devoted to their ledgers as any monk was to his prayers, and those ledgers, carefully maintained in the counting houses of Rome and Florence, told a story of remarkable success. The papal account was the foundation on which everything else was built, the steady source of profit that funded expansion and survived setbacks. As long as the Medici maintained the favour of successive popes, their position seemed secure. In the decades to come, that position would be tested. Popes would change, political circumstances would shift, and competitors would seek to displace the Medici from their privileged position. But for now, in the middle years of the 15th century, the relationship between the Medici Bank and the papal court was a model of mutual benefit, a partnership between spiritual authority and financial expertise that enriched both parties and shaped the course of history. Cosimo de' Medici was nearly 40 years old when his father Giovanni died in February of 1429. This was not a young man inheriting a business he barely understood. Cosimo had been involved in the family bank for decades, travelling to distant branches, negotiating with important clients, absorbing the lessons his father had to teach. He was fully prepared for the responsibilities that now fell to him. In appearance, Cosimo was not particularly impressive. Contemporary descriptions and later portraits show a man with a long, somewhat melancholy face, a prominent nose and thoughtful eyes. He was not handsome in any conventional sense, but those who met him invariably remarked on his intelligence, his quick understanding, his ability to grasp complex situations and see to the heart of matters. His education had been extensive. Unlike many merchants of his generation, Cosimo had studied classical languages and literature. He could read Latin with ease and had at least some knowledge of Greek. He corresponded with scholars and took genuine pleasure in philosophical discussions. This was not mere pretension. Cosimo's intellectual interests were deep and sincere, and they would shape his patronage in the decades to come. But Cosimo was also thoroughly practical. He understood that a banker's primary responsibility was to his bank, that culture and learning were luxuries built on a foundation of commercial success. He brought to his father's enterprise not just continuity, but a vision for expansion that Giovanni, with his more cautious temperament, might never have attempted. The Medici bank that Cosimo inherited was already substantial, with branches in Florence, Rome, and Venice, along with involvement in various trading operations. Under Cosimo's leadership, this network would expand dramatically. New branches were established in strategic commercial centres across Europe. Each expansion was carefully considered, each new location chosen for its potential contribution to the overall enterprise. The Geneva branch, which would later move to Lyon, served the lucrative trade fairs that brought merchants from across Europe together for concentrated periods of buying, selling, and settling accounts. These fairs were essential nodes in medieval commerce, places where debts could be cleared and new agreements made. A banking presence at the fairs was enormously valuable. The Bruges branch tapped into the wealthy markets of the Low Countries, where Flemish cloth and English wool flowed through one of Europe's busiest commercial centres. Bruges in the 15th century was a cosmopolitan city, home to merchants from every trading nation, a place where fortunes were made in the exchange of goods from the Baltic, the Mediterranean, and beyond. The London branch provided access to England, a kingdom whose wool was prized throughout Europe and whose rulers were perpetually in need of financing. This was dangerous territory, given the history of English royal defaults that had destroyed the Bardi and Peruzzi. But the potential profits were substantial, and Cosimo believed that with proper management the risks could be controlled. Milan, Avignon, Pisa, and other cities hosted Medici operations at various times. The network ebbed and flowed as circumstances changed, with branches opening when opportunity beckoned and closing when conditions deteriorated. But the overall trajectory under Cosimo was one of expansion, of increasing reach and capability. What made this expansion possible was the organizational structure that Cosimo refined and perfected. Each branch of the Medici Bank was established as a separate partnership, legally distinct from the others. The Medici in Florence, typically Cosimo himself and later his sons, held majority stakes in each of these partnerships. But local managers also held significant shares, making them partners rather than mere employees. This structure had several crucial advantages. First, it limited liability. If the London branch made bad loans and failed, the losses would be borne by that branch's capital and its partners. The failure would not automatically cascade through the entire organisation, dragging down profitable operations in Rome or Florence. Each branch stood or fell largely on its own merits. Second, the structure created powerful incentives for good management. A branch manager who was also a partner had his own money at stake. His personal fortune would grow if the branch prospered and shrink if it failed. This alignment of interests encouraged careful, responsible banking in a way that a simple salary never could. Third, the structure allowed for flexibility. Different branches could be capitalized differently depending on local conditions and opportunities. Partnership agreements could be renegotiated when circumstances changed. Managers who proved incompetent could be replaced without disrupting the entire organization. The system was resilient in ways that more centralized structures were not. At the center of this web sat Cosimo and his closest associates in Florence. They monitored the performance of each branch through regular correspondence and periodic audits. They made decisions about major loans and investments. They moved capital between branches as needs required. They maintained the libro segreto, the secret ledger that tracked the overall Medici fortune across all its various components. The libro segreto was a remarkable document, perhaps the closest thing to a consolidated financial statement that medieval banking produced. While each branch kept its own books according to the standard practices of double-entry bookkeeping, the libro segreto aggregated the information, showing the total assets and liabilities of the Medici enterprise. This gave Cosimo a view of his financial position that few of his contemporaries could match. Managing such a far-flung operation required excellent people. Cosimo devoted considerable attention to identifying, training, and placing talented managers. He looked for men who combined commercial acumen with personal integrity, who could be trusted to represent Medici interests in distant cities without constant supervision. These branch managers, the maggiori, were the human infrastructure that made the system work. Finding such men was not easy. A successful branch manager needed to understand local conditions, to build relationships with local merchants and officials, to navigate unfamiliar legal systems and cultural expectations. He needed to be entrepreneurial enough to identify opportunities, but cautious enough to avoid disasters. He needed to be loyal to the Medici, while also pursuing his own legitimate interests as a partner. Cosimo's ability to identify and cultivate such talent was one of his greatest strengths. The men who managed Medici branches during his tenure were generally capable and honest, with a few notable exceptions. When problems did arise, Cosimo dealt with them firmly but fairly, replacing underperforming managers while trying to preserve the relationships that made the business function. The financial success that resulted from all this was remarkable. Under Cosimo's leadership, the Medici Bank became arguably the largest and most profitable banking operation in Europe. The precise figures are difficult to determine, as medieval accounting did not translate easily into modern terms, but estimates suggest that at its peak, the bank's capital may have reached something like 150,000 florins, an enormous sum for the time. These profits funded not just business expansion, but also Cosimo's growing role in Florentine politics. This was perhaps inevitable. In a city where wealth and political power were closely intertwined, a man of Cosimo's resources could not remain a purely private citizen, even if he wished to, and there is little evidence that Cosimo wished to remain in the background. Florence in the early 15th century was officially a republic, governed by a complex system of councils and committees. Important offices were filled through a combination of election and lot, with eligible citizens drawn from bags containing the names of those deemed qualified to serve. In theory, this system prevented any single family from dominating the government. In practice, the system could be manipulated by those with sufficient wealth and influence. Cosimo built his political position carefully, using the methods that wealthy Florentines had always used. He cultivated allies among other important families. He provided loans and favours to those who might be useful. He supported public projects that enhanced his reputation for civic generosity. He placed his supporters in key positions when opportunities arose. But Cosimo's growing influence alarmed rival factions, particularly those clustered around the Albizzi family, who had long been among Florence's leading citizens. The Albizzi and their allies saw Cosimo as a threat to their own position, a man whose wealth and ambition might upset the delicate balance of power among the city's elite. In 1433, the Albizzi faction struck. Using their control of key government offices, they arranged for Cosimo to be arrested on charges of attempting to elevate himself above the station of an ordinary citizen. The charge was vague, but the danger was real. In Florentine politics, such accusations could lead to execution. Cosimo was imprisoned in the tower of the Palazzo della Signoria, the seat of Florence's government. For several days his fate hung in the balance. The Albizzi pressed for a death sentence. Cosimo's supporters argued for mercy. According to later accounts, Cosimo himself was not passive during this crisis, using his wealth to bribe key officials and ensure that the harshest punishment would not be imposed. The compromise that emerged was exile. Cosimo was sentenced to 10 years' banishment, first to Padua and then to Venice. His brother Lorenzo and other family members were also exiled. It was a severe punishment, but not a fatal one, and crucially, the Medici bank was not confiscated. Cosimo left Florence, but he left with his fortune largely intact. The year of exile was a strange interlude. Cosimo settled in Venice, where the Medici had long-standing business relationships. He was received with honour by the Venetian government, which recognised both his wealth and his potential future importance. He continued to manage his business affairs, corresponding with branch managers and making decisions about the bank's operations. Meanwhile, in Florence, the Albizzi government was struggling. Without Cosimo's banking services, some of the city's financial operations became more difficult. More importantly, the exile had made Cosimo sympathetic in ways he had not been before. He became a martyr to oligarchic overreach, a victim of factional jealousy. His supporters in Florence worked quietly to undermine the Albizzi regime. In September of 1434, a new government took office in Florence, one dominated by Cosimo's allies. Almost immediately, the sentence of exile was revoked. Cosimo was invited to return. He entered the city in triumph, greeted by crowds of supporters. The Albizzi and their leading allies fled into exile themselves, their positions permanently destroyed. The return from exile marked the beginning of Cosimo's 30-year dominance of Florence. He never held any permanent office. He never took a title or assumed formal authority. Officially, Florence remained a republic with its traditional institutions intact, but everyone understood that Cosimo was the real power in the city, the man whose approval was needed for any significant decision. This was an extraordinary political achievement. Cosimo ruled without ruling, exercised power without holding office. He did this through a combination of methods. He controlled the electoral process, ensuring that his supporters were placed in key positions. He provided loans and favours that created networks of obligation. He cultivated a reputation for wisdom and fairness that made citizens willing to defer to his judgment. Contemporary observers struggled to describe his position. Pope Pius, who knew Cosimo personally, wrote that he was king in all but name. Others called him the godfather of Florence, a term that captured both his benevolent image and his underlying power. After his death, the city would grant him the title Pater Patriae, father of his country, an honour previously reserved for ancient Roman heroes. Cosimo's approach to power was captured in a motto he reportedly favoured, Festina lente, a Latin phrase meaning make haste slowly. This paradoxical advice perfectly expressed his method. He was ambitious but patient. He pursued his goals but carefully, methodically, without the dramatic gestures that might provoke opposition. He accumulated power gradually, so gradually that by the time rivals recognized what had happened, it was too late to stop him. The bank flourished under Cosimo's political dominance. Control of Florence gave the Medici access to state funds and public contracts. It allowed them to shape policy in ways that benefited their commercial interests. It protected them from the kind of political attack that had sent Cosimo into exile. The relationship between banking success and political power became self-reinforcing. But Cosimo was no mere accumulator of wealth and power. His interest genuinely extended beyond commerce and politics to the realms of art, architecture, and ideas. The patronage that would transform Florence and fund the Renaissance began in earnest during Cosimo's tenure. We will explore this patronage in detail shortly. For now, it is enough to note that Cosimo saw no contradiction between profit and beauty, between the counting house and the artist's studio. Cosimo de' Medici died in August of 1464 at the age of 75. He had led the family bank for 35 years and dominated Florence for 30. He left behind an enterprise at the peak of its power and influence, a city transformed by his patronage, and a model of political control that his descendants would attempt to maintain. His body was interred in San Lorenzo, the church his family had rebuilt. The tomb was simple, in keeping with Cosimo's preference for understated displays, but the inscription captured his significance, Pater Patriae. He was, in death as in life, the father of his city. We have spoken of the Medici Bank in broad strokes, tracing its expansion under Cosimo, its relationship with the papal court, its growing wealth and influence. But we have not yet entered the counting house itself, not yet watched the daily work that transformed all this ambition into reality. Let us now step inside and see how a Renaissance bank actually operated. The heart of Medici operations in Florence was a building on the Via Porta Rossa, not far from the great market square. This was not yet the magnificent Medici palace that Cosimo would later build. It was a more modest structure, functional rather than grand, designed for the serious work of commerce. Here, in rooms filled with ledgers and correspondence, the business of banking unfolded day after day. The central feature of any banking establishment was the tavola, the table or counter where transactions were conducted. The word bank itself derives from the Italian banca, meaning bench or table, a reminder that banking began with men sitting at simple wooden surfaces, exchanging money and recording debts. The Medici tavola would have been more elaborate than a street money changer's bench, but the principle was the same. This was where customers came to deposit funds, to arrange transfers, to negotiate loans. Behind the tavola and in the rooms beyond, clerks bent over their work. These young men, many of them still in their teens, formed the workforce that kept the banking operation running. They copied letters in careful hands, ensuring that correspondence with distant branches was properly documented. They maintained the ledgers, entering each transaction in the precise format that double-entry bookkeeping required. They ran errands, carried messages, and performed the countless small tasks that a complex business demanded. The life of a banking clerk was not glamorous, but it offered something valuable: education. A young man who entered a Medici counting house as a garçon, an apprentice, would learn skills that could serve him for a lifetime. He would master the intricacies of bookkeeping, the mechanics of bills of exchange, the the art of evaluating creditworthiness. If he proved capable and trustworthy, he might rise through the ranks, eventually becoming a fattore, a factor or agent with significant responsibilities, and perhaps someday a maggiore, a general manager running an entire branch. This hierarchy was essential to the bank's functioning. The Medici themselves could not be everywhere, couldn't personally supervise every transaction in every city where they did business. They needed capable subordinates who could be trusted to act wisely in their absence. The system of training clerks, testing their abilities over years, and gradually promoting the most promising created a pipeline of talent that the bank depended upon. The maggiori who managed individual branches were particularly important. These men were not merely employees but partners, with their own capital invested alongside the Medicis. A branch manager in Bruges or London had to make countless decisions without the ability to consult Florence. Should this merchant be extended credit? At what exchange rate should this bill be bought or sold? How should a dispute with a customer be resolved? The quality of these decisions determined whether a branch prospered or failed. Cosimo and his associates in Florence monitored the branches through regular correspondence and periodic reviews of the books. Letters travelled constantly along the trade routes, carrying news, instructions, and questions. A well-managed branch would send detailed reports of its activities, allowing the central office to track performance and identify problems before they became serious. But there were limits to what could be supervised from a distance. In the end, the Medici had to trust their branch managers, and this trust was not always warranted. The foundation of all this activity was the system of record-keeping known as double-entry bookkeeping. This method, which had developed in Italian commercial cities over the preceding centuries, was one of the most important innovations in the history of business. It provided a way to track complex transactions accurately and to detect errors or fraud that might otherwise go unnoticed. The principle of double-entry bookkeeping is elegant in its simplicity. Every transaction is recorded twice, once as a debit and once as a credit. If you receive 100 florins from a customer, you debit your cash account, showing that you have more money, and you credit the customer's account, showing that they have deposited funds with you. The two entries are equal and opposite. Debits must always equal credits. This requirement that the books must balance provides a powerful check on accuracy. If you add up all the debits and all the credits, the totals must match. If they don't match, there is an error somewhere, and you must find it. This simple discipline forced medieval bookkeepers to be careful and systematic. It caught mistakes that might otherwise have accumulated into serious problems. Double-entry bookkeeping also provided something that earlier accounting methods could not: a clear picture of a business's financial position at any given moment. By examining the ledgers, a merchant could see not just how much cash he had on hand, but also how much he was owed by customers, how much he owed to suppliers, what inventory he held, and what his overall profit or loss had been over a given period. This information was invaluable for making good business decisions. The Medici were masters of this system. Their books were maintained with meticulous care, the entries made in clear hands, the calculations checked and rechecked. Errors did occur, as they always do when humans are involved, but the system was designed to catch and correct them. The surviving Medici account books, now preserved in archives in Florence, are monuments to medieval commercial sophistication. Beyond simple bookkeeping, the Medici Bank engaged in financial operations of considerable complexity. The bill of exchange, which we discussed earlier in the context of papal banking, was a tool they employed constantly in their daily business. Let us trace a typical transaction to see how it worked in practice. Imagine a wool merchant in Bruges who needs to pay a supplier in Florence. He has sold his cloth to local buyers and has accumulated a substantial sum in Flemish currency. But his supplier in Florence wants to be paid in florins, and sending actual coins from Bruges to Florence would be expensive, slow, and dangerous. What can our merchant do? He goes to the Medici branch in Bruges and presents his problem. The branch manager offers a solution. The merchant can deposit his Flemish money with the Bruges branch and receive in exchange a bill of exchange, a document instructing the Medici in Florence to pay a specified sum in florins to the merchant supplier. The merchant sends this document to his supplier, who presents it to the Medici Bank in Florence and receives payment. The money has effectively travelled from Bruges to Florence without any physical coins making the journey. The Medici branch in Bruges now has the Flemish money, and the Medici branch in Florence has paid out florins. Internally, the two branches settle accounts with each other, the Bruges branch owing Florence for the payment it made. These internal settlements might happen through actual transfers of funds or simply through offsetting transactions flowing in the opposite direction. The profit for the Medici comes from the exchange rate. When they convert the merchant's Flemish money to florins, they use a rate that is slightly more favourable to themselves than the prevailing market rate. This spread might be small on any individual transaction, perhaps 2 or 3%, but across thousands of transactions it generated substantial income. Exchange rates fluctuated constantly, influenced by supply and demand, by political events, by seasonal patterns of trade. A skilled banker could profit from these fluctuations, buying bills when rates were favourable and selling when they improved. This was not quite speculation in the modern sense, but it required expertise and judgment. The best Medici managers had an instinct for exchange rate movements that served the bank well. The Medici were not only bankers but also merchants in their own right. They maintained substantial operations in the wool and silk trades, the industries that had made Florence prosperous. These commercial activities complemented their banking business in important ways. The wool trade, organised under the guild known as the Arte della Lana, involved importing raw wool from England and Spain, processing it through numerous steps of cleaning, carding, spinning, dyeing and weaving, and selling the finished cloth to markets across Europe and the Mediterranean. This was a capital-intensive business, requiring substantial funds to purchase raw materials and finance months of production before any revenue was received. The Medici financed wool operations both for themselves and for other merchants. They provided the credit that allowed the trade to function, collecting interest in the form of exchange profits when wool merchants used Medici bills to pay their English or Spanish suppliers. The banking and the trading reinforced each other, each providing opportunities for the other. The silk trade, governed by the Arte della Seta, was similar in structure, but produced even more valuable goods. Silk cloth was a luxury product, purchased by the wealthy and powerful across Europe. Florence's silk weavers were renowned for their skill, and Florentine silk commanded premium prices. The Medici invested heavily in this business, both manufacturing silk and financing others who did. This combination of banking and trade provided what we might today call vertical integration. The Medici were involved at every stage of the process, from financing the purchase of raw materials to manufacturing finished goods to providing the financial services that moved payment across borders. This integration gave them information advantages that purely financial competitors could not match. News travelled along the Medici network faster than it travelled through other channels. A letter from the Bruges branch might contain not just banking business, but also intelligence about political developments in the Low Countries, about the health of important customers, about shifts in demand for particular products. This information helped the Medici make better decisions, anticipating problems before they materialized and identifying opportunities before competitors could act. Risk management was essential to the bank's survival. The Medici had learned from the disasters that destroyed earlier banking houses, and they structured their operations to avoid repeating those mistakes. Diversification was a key principle. The bank's activities were spread across multiple branches, multiple lines of business, and multiple types of customers. A problem in one area would not necessarily affect the others. The branch structure that we discussed earlier was itself a form of risk management. Because each branch was organized as a separate partnership with its own capital, losses in one branch were contained rather than spreading through the entire organization. When the London branch eventually ran into serious trouble, the failure damaged but did not destroy the overall Medici enterprise. Within each branch, lending was supposed to follow prudent guidelines. No single borrower should receive too large a share of the branch's capital. Loans should be secured where possible, backed by collateral that could be seized if the borrower defaulted. Credit should be extended based on careful evaluation of the borrower's ability to repay, not merely on their social standing or political importance. These guidelines were not always followed. As we shall see, some branch managers made loans that violated every principle of prudent banking with disastrous consequences. But the guidelines existed, and when they were followed, they served the bank well. At the centre of everything was the libro segreto, the secret ledger maintained in Florence that tracked the overall Medici fortune. While each branch kept its own books according to standard methods, the libro segreto aggregated the information showing the Medici's stake in each partnership, the profits or losses each had generated, and the total family wealth. This document was closely guarded, shared only among the senior family members and their most trusted advisors. The libro segreto provided something rare in medieval business: a consolidated view of a complex multi-entity enterprise. Most merchants could tell you how a particular venture was performing. The Medici could tell you how their entire operation was performing, which branches were thriving and which were struggling, where capital might be redeployed for better returns. This information advantage helped them make better strategic decisions than competitors operating with less visibility into their own affairs. All of this, the careful bookkeeping, the skilled management of exchange transactions, the diversified operations, the prudent risk management, combined to create a banking enterprise of remarkable sophistication. The Medici Bank at its peak was not simply large, it was well run, a model of how complex financial operations could be organized and managed. The clerks bending over their ledgers in the counting house on Via Porta Rossa might not have thought of themselves as participants in anything historic. They were simply doing their jobs, entering debits and credits, copying letters, reconciling accounts. But their careful work, repeated day after day and year after year, was the foundation on which everything else rested. Without accurate books, the Medici could not have known how their business was performing. Without reliable systems, they could not have trusted distant managers. Without the discipline of double-entry bookkeeping, errors and fraud would have accumulated until they destroyed the enterprise. The art of Medici banking was not flashy or dramatic. It was the quiet art of getting things right, of building systems that worked, of finding people who could be trusted and giving them the tools they needed. It was an art that Cosimo and his father had mastered, and it would serve the family well for decades to come. The ledgers and the counting house tell only part of the Medici story. If we were to walk through Florence today, we would see everywhere the evidence of something beyond commerce, something that transformed the wealth of bankers into beauty that has endured for centuries. The churches and palaces, the paintings and sculptures, the libraries filled with ancient texts. These are the visible legacy of Medici patronage, the art that banking bought. Why did the Medici become such generous patrons? The question seems simple, but the answer is layered, as most human motivations are. There was no single reason, but rather a constellation of impulses that combined to produce one of history's greatest flowerings of artistic achievement. Piety played a genuine role. The Medici were devout Catholics, living in an age when the salvation of one's soul was a matter of urgent concern. The Church taught that wealth brought spiritual dangers, that was easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. How could a wealthy banker hope for salvation? The answer, provided by medieval theology, was that wealth itself was not sinful if used for godly purposes. A rich man who built churches, who funded monasteries, who supported the work of the church, could transform his potentially damning fortune into a vehicle for salvation. The money that might have dragged him to hell could instead lift him toward heaven. This was not mere rationalization. It was sincere belief, and it motivated enormous expenditure on religious art and architecture. Prestige was another factor. Florence in the 15th century was intensely competitive, its leading families vying for status and honour. Patronage of art and building was one of the primary ways that wealthy citizens demonstrated their importance. A magnificent chapel, a beautiful altarpiece, a grand palace. These were statements of success that everyone could see. They announced to the world that this family had arrived, that they possessed not just wealth, but the taste and judgment to use it well. The Medici were not alone in this competition. Other great families, the Strozzi, the Rucellai, the Pazzi, also built and commissioned and patronized. But the Medici eventually outpaced them all, their patronage so extensive and so consistent that it became inseparable from the cultural identity of Florence itself. There was also genuine love of beauty, a factor we should not discount. Cosimo and his descendants were not merely purchasing status. They were men of cultivation and education who took real pleasure in beautiful things. They collected ancient manuscripts and Roman sculptures. They conversed with artists and philosophers. They understood and appreciated what they were funding in ways that distinguished them from patrons who simply wrote checks. The tradition of artistic patronage in Florence predated the Medici. Wealthy families had been funding churches and commissioning artworks for generations. The great guilds of the city supported public art as demonstrations of their civic pride. The commune itself invested in buildings and monuments that proclaimed Florence's importance. The Medici stepped into an existing culture of patronage, but they elevated it to new heights. Giovanni di Bicci, the founder of the bank, began the family's serious involvement in artistic patronage. His primary project was the reconstruction of San Lorenzo, the parish church of the neighbourhood where the Medici lived. The old church, dating back centuries, had fallen into disrepair. Giovanni agreed to fund its rebuilding, a significant commitment that would continue for decades. The architect chosen for San Lorenzo was Filippo Brunelleschi, already famous as the designer of the great dome that crowned Florence's cathedral. Brunelleschi brought to San Lorenzo the principles of classical architecture that he had studied in the ruins of ancient Rome. The church he designed was revolutionary in its clarity and harmony, its columns and arches creating a sense of order and proportion that had not been seen in Florence for 1,000 years. Giovanni did not live to see San Lorenzo completed. The project continued under Cosimo, who expanded its scope and eventually paid for most of the construction. The church became a Medici project in the fullest sense, its chapels and sacristies filled with Medici tombs, its every surface a testament to the family's piety and generosity. But San Lorenzo was only the beginning of Cosimo's patronage. He would fund projects throughout Florence and beyond, transforming the city's appearance and establishing the Medici as the preeminent patrons of their age. The convent of San Marco became one of Cosimo's most personal projects. This Dominican monastery had fallen on hard times, its buildings crumbling, its community diminished. Cosimo agreed to fund a complete reconstruction, paying for new dormitories, a new church, and most remarkably a library to house a magnificent collection of manuscripts. The architect for San Marco was Michelozzo, a friend and frequent collaborator of Cosimo's. The buildings he designed were elegant but restrained, appropriate for a community of monks devoted to prayer and contemplation. The library was particularly innovative, a long hall filled with light, its desks arranged to display the precious books that Cosimo donated. Those books were among the treasures of the age. Cosimo had spent years and considerable sums gathering manuscripts, particularly Greek texts that had been lost to Western Europe during the medieval centuries. These were the works of Plato and Aristotle, of ancient poets and historians, the intellectual heritage of classical civilization. By placing them in a library open to scholars, Cosimo ensured that they would be studied and copied and preserved. The painter who decorated San Marco was a Dominican friar known to us as Fra Angelico. His real name was Guido di Pietro, but his art was so ethereal, so seemingly touched by divine grace, that later generations called him the Angelic Brother. Working in the quiet cells of the monastery, Fra Angelico created frescoes of extraordinary beauty and devotion. Each monk's cell received its own small painting, an image for meditation and prayer. The subjects were scenes from the life of Christ, rendered with the simplicity and tenderness that still moves viewers today. The colours are soft, the compositions clear, the figures radiating a gentle holiness. These were not paintings meant to impress with their grandeur. They were spiritual tools, aids to contemplation painted by a man who was himself devoted to the religious life. Fra Angelico also painted larger works for the public areas of the convent, including a magnificent Annunciation at the top of the stairs leading to the dormitory. In this image, the angel Gabriel approaches the Virgin Mary in a setting that resembles the very cloister where the painting hangs. The divine breaks into the ordinary, just as it does in the daily life of prayer. Cosimo's patronage extended to sculptors as well. The greatest of these was Donatello, an artist of fierce originality whose works helped define the Renaissance style. Donatello had known Cosimo since both were young men, and their friendship lasted a lifetime. When Donatello died in 1466, he was buried in San Lorenzo near Cosimo's own tomb, a final testament to their long association. Donatello created numerous works for the Medici, including the famous bronze David that once stood in the courtyard of the Medici Palace. This was the first freestanding nude sculpture since ancient times, a young shepherd boy triumphant over the fallen giant, his foot resting on Goliath's severed head. The sculpture was revolutionary in its naturalism and its evocation of classical antiquity. Standing in the Medici courtyard, it announced to visitors that they were entering a household where ancient ideals had been reborn. The Medici Palace itself was a masterpiece of architecture and a statement of family identity. Cosimo commissioned it from Michelozzo in the 1440s, and it became a model for urban palaces throughout Italy. The exterior was dignified but not ostentatious, its rusticated stone suggesting strength and permanence. The interior was another matter, a magnificent display of wealth and taste. The courtyard was filled with ancient sculptures and inscriptions that Cosimo had collected, creating an atmosphere that was part home, part museum. The private chapel was decorated with frescoes by Benozzo Gozzoli depicting the journey of the Magi, a procession of gorgeously dressed figures winding through an idealized Tuscan landscape. Among the faces in that procession, we can recognize members of the Medici family themselves, subtly inserted into sacred history. Beyond the visual arts, Cosimo supported scholars and philosophers who were recovering and interpreting the wisdom of the ancient world. The most important of these was Marsilio Ficino, a physician's son whom Cosimo recognized as possessing extraordinary intellectual gifts. Cosimo provided Ficino with a villa near Florence and a lifetime income, freeing him to devote himself entirely to scholarship. Ficino's great project was the translation of Plato's dialogues from Greek into Latin, making them accessible to educated readers throughout Europe. This was not merely an academic exercise. Ficino believed that Platonic philosophy contained profound truths that could be reconciled with Christian teaching, that the ancient Greeks had glimpsed something of divine wisdom. His translations and commentaries sparked a Platonic revival that influenced art, literature and theology for generations. Around Ficino gathered a circle of scholars, poets and artists that came to be known as the Platonic Academy. This was not a formal institution with buildings and students, but rather an informal network of brilliant individuals who met to discuss philosophy, share manuscripts, and inspire one another. Cosimo himself participated in these discussions when his health and duties permitted, finding in philosophical conversation a respite from the pressures of business and politics. The Academy's influence permeated Florentine culture. Artists who attended its gatherings absorbed ideas about beauty and harmony, about the relationship between the visible world and invisible truths that shaped their work. Botticelli's famous paintings of mythological subjects, the birth of Venus and Primavera, are suffused with Neoplatonic symbolism that he learned from this intellectual circle. The recovery of classical texts was not limited to philosophy. Cosimo sponsored the collection of manuscripts in many fields, ancient histories and scientific treatises, works of rhetoric and poetry. He sent agents to Constantinople and other centres of Greek learning to find and purchase manuscripts. He hired scribes to copy texts so they could be more widely distributed. He created libraries that preserved these treasures for future generations. This passion for the ancient world was part of a broader movement we call humanism. The humanists believed that the wisdom of Greece and Rome had much to teach their own age, that the classical past offered models of excellence in art, literature, and civic life. By recovering and studying ancient texts, they hoped to revive the glory of antiquity in their own time. The Medici were not the only patrons of humanism, but they were among the most important. Their support helped create an environment in which scholars could work, in which ancient ideas could circulate, in which the past could speak to the present. Without this patronage, the Renaissance as we know it might never have occurred. We should pause to consider the connection between the counting house and the artist's studio. The money that paid for all this beauty came from the transactions we described earlier, from bills of exchange and interest disguised as exchange profits, from the papal account and the wool trade and dozens of other commercial activities. Every fresco and sculpture, every manuscript and building was purchased with funds generated by the careful work of clerks bent over ledgers. Some might see a contradiction here, or even hypocrisy. The bankers who found ways around the church's prohibition on usury used their profits to build churches. The merchants who drove hard bargains in the marketplace became generous patrons of art. But perhaps there is no contradiction. The Medici understood that wealth carried responsibilities as well as privileges. They used their fortune to create lasting beauty, and in doing so they redeemed it. Art was an investment for the Medici, though not in the way we typically use that word. They did not expect their paintings and buildings to appreciate in monetary value, but they did expect returns of other kinds. Prestige and reputation, the goodwill of the community, the hope of divine favour, the satisfaction of genuine aesthetic pleasure, these were the dividends that patronage paid. The transformation of Florence under Medici patronage was profound. A visitor arriving in 1460 would have found a city that looked dramatically different from the Florence of a century earlier. New churches and palaces had risen. Public spaces had been adorned with sculptures and fountains. The visual language of classicism, with its columns and pediments and rounded arches, had become the dominant architectural style. It was a city that looked forward by looking back, that created the future by recovering the past. This transformation would continue and accelerate under Cosimo's successors. Lorenzo, his grandson, would patronize a new generation of artists, including the young Michelangelo. The artistic achievements of the Medici era would become the foundation of Western art, studied and imitated for centuries to come. But all of this began with decisions made in counting houses and palace studies, with wealthy men choosing to spend their money on beauty rather than mere accumulation. The Medici could have kept their florins in their vaults. Instead, they scattered them like seeds, and from those seeds grew wonders that still bloom today. Standing in Florence now, in the quiet of a church that Cosimo built, watching light fall on frescoes that his money paid for, we can feel the connection across the centuries. The banker and his ledgers have long since turned to dust, but the beauty he purchased remains, a gift to every generation that has followed. This is perhaps the most remarkable return on investment in history. Cosimo de' Medici had built something extraordinary, a banking empire intertwined with political dominance and cultural patronage. But even the greatest builders must eventually pass their work to others. When Cosimo died in 1464, the question of succession became urgent. Could the next generation maintain what he had created? Cosimo's heir was his son Piero, a man already in his late 40s when he assumed leadership of the family. Piero was intelligent and cultivated, sharing his father's love of art and learning. He continued the family's patronage, commissioning works and supporting scholars in the Medici tradition. But Piero suffered from a condition that had plagued him for years, a severe form of gout that left him often bedridden and always in pain. The Florentines called him Piero il Gottoso, Piero the Gouty. It was not a kind nickname, but it captured something true about his situation. A man racked by chronic illness could not provide the active, engaged leadership that Cosimo had offered. Piero could not travel to distant branches, could not meet constantly with clients and allies, could not project the vigour that political and commercial success required. Piero's reign lasted only 5 years. He died in December of 1469, leaving the family fortunes to his sons. The elder was Lorenzo, just 20 years old. The younger was Giuliano, only 16. They were young men inheriting enormous responsibilities, leading a banking house and an unofficial government that their grandfather had spent a lifetime constructing. Lorenzo de' Medici would become the most famous member of his family, the one whose name echoes most loudly through the centuries. Later generations would call him Lorenzo il Magnifico, Lorenzo the Magnificent, and the title was not mere flattery. He was magnificent in his talents, his achievements, and his appetites. He was also, as we shall see, magnificent in ways that did not always serve the bank his great-grandfather had founded. In appearance, Lorenzo was not handsome. His face was heavy, his nose flat and somewhat misshapen, his complexion sallow. But those who met him were invariably struck by his presence, his energy, his charm. He could be witty and warm, drawing people to him with an ease that more conventionally attractive men might envy. He was a natural leader, someone others wanted to follow. Lorenzo's education had been exceptional even by Medici standards. He had studied with the finest scholars of the age, absorbing classical literature and philosophy, learning to write poetry that would earn him recognition as one of the finest Italian poets of his century. He was equally at home discussing Plato with philosophers and horses with stable hands. He moved through every level of Florentine society with apparent effortlessness. But Lorenzo was not primarily a banker. This simple fact would prove consequential. His grandfather Cosimo had been trained in the counting house, had understood the details of bills of exchange and branch management, had kept his hand firmly on the tiller of the family enterprise. Lorenzo's interest lay elsewhere, in poetry and philosophy, in politics and diplomacy, in the pleasures of cultured conversation. He delegated the management of the bank to others, and those others were not always competent or honest. The early years of Lorenzo's leadership were promising. He consolidated his political position in Florence, building on the foundation his grandfather and father had laid. He cultivated relationships with other Italian states, positioning himself as a mediator and peacemaker. He continued and expanded the family's artistic patronage, gathering around him a brilliant circle of poets, artists and philosophers. Then, in 1478, disaster struck. The Pazzi were one of Florence's oldest and most distinguished families, rivals of the Medici who resented the newcomers' dominance. Jacopo de' Pazzi and his nephew Francesco had nursed their grievances for years, watching as the Medici accumulated the power and prestige they felt should have been theirs. Now they saw an opportunity. Pope Sixtus IV had quarrelled bitterly with Lorenzo over political and financial matters. The Pope had transferred the papal banking account from the Medici to the Passi, a devastating blow to Medici prestige and profits. More dangerously, Sixtus was willing to support a conspiracy against Medici rule in Florence. He may not have explicitly approved assassination, but he knew violence was planned and did nothing to prevent it. The conspirators chose their moment carefully. On the morning of April 26, 1478, Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano attended High Mass in the Cathedral of Florence. The great dome that Brunelleschi had built soared above them. The congregation packed the vast space. At the ringing of the sanctuary bell, at the most sacred moment of the Mass, the assassin struck. Giuliano de' Medici was attacked by multiple assailants and stabbed repeatedly. He died on the cathedral floor, his blood staining the marble, his body bearing 19 wounds. He was 25 years old. Lorenzo was luckier. He was attacked as well, receiving a wound to his neck, but he managed to fight off his assailants with the help of friends. He retreated to the sacristy, barricading himself behind its heavy bronze doors until it was clear the immediate danger had passed. The conspiracy failed in its primary objective. Lorenzo survived, and the reaction of the Florentine people was swift and terrible. Far from rising against the Medici as the conspirators had hoped, the citizens rallied to Lorenzo's support. The Pazzi and their allies were hunted through the streets. Francesco de' Pazzi was dragged from his hiding place and hanged from a window of the Palazzo della Signoria, still in his nightshirt. Archbishop Salviati of Pisa, who'd participated in the plot, was hanged beside him, still in his ecclesiastical robes. Jacopo de' Pazzi was captured, tortured, and executed. The Pazzi name was erased from public monuments. The family was destroyed utterly. The aftermath of the conspiracy was complicated. Pope Sixtus, furious at the execution of an archbishop, excommunicated Lorenzo and placed Florence under interdict. A war followed, pitting Florence against papal and Neapolitan forces. The situation seemed dire, Florence isolated and threatened. Lorenzo responded with a masterstroke of personal diplomacy. In December of 1479, he travelled alone to Naples to negotiate directly with King Ferrante, one of Florence's enemies. It was an enormous risk. Ferrante was notoriously treacherous, and Lorenzo was placing himself entirely in the king's power. But Lorenzo's charm and intelligence won the day. After 3 months of negotiation, he returned to Florence with a peace agreement. His prestige soared higher than ever. The years following the Pazzi conspiracy were in many ways the golden age of Lorenzo's Florence. The city enjoyed relative peace and remarkable cultural flowering. Artists and scholars gathered around Lorenzo, producing works that would define the Renaissance for later generations. Sandro Botticelli painted his most famous works during these years, the birth of Venus and Primavera, images of mythological beauty suffused with the Neoplatonic philosophy that permeated Lorenzo's circle. These paintings show a world of grace and harmony, where ancient gods walk through gardens of eternal spring. They are perhaps the most perfect visual expressions of the humanist ideals that the Medici had supported for generations. An even more remarkable talent was emerging. A young sculptor named Michelangelo Buonarroti, born in 1475, came to Lorenzo's attention while still a teenager. Lorenzo recognized the boy's extraordinary gifts and brought him into the Medici household, treating him almost as a son. Michelangelo ate at the family table, studied the ancient sculptures in the Medici gardens, and absorbed the intellectual atmosphere that surrounded Lorenzo. The greatest artist of the Renaissance was shaped by Medici patronage. Leonardo da Vinci, though not as closely connected to Lorenzo as Michelangelo, was also part of the Florentine artistic scene during these years. Lorenzo's Florence was a place where genius could flourish, where talented young men could find support and inspiration, where the pursuit of beauty was valued as highly as the pursuit of wealth. Lorenzo himself contributed to this cultural flowering, not just as patron but as participant. His poetry was genuinely accomplished, his carnival songs famous throughout Italy, his philosophical writings taken seriously by scholars. He was not merely a wealthy man buying art, he was an artist himself, a creator who understood from the inside what he was supporting. Yet beneath this brilliant surface, problems were accumulating. The Medici Bank, the foundation on which everything else rested, was weakening. The loss of the papal account to the Pazzi before the conspiracy had been a severe blow. Even after the Pazzi were destroyed, the relationship with the papacy remained strained. Sixtus Theodoros never forgave Florence for executing his archbishop, and the papal business did not return to Medici hands during his pontificate. More damaging were problems in the bank's branch network. Lorenzo, absorbed by politics and culture, had delegated management to Francesco Sassetti, an experienced banker who had served the family for decades. But Sassetti was aging and increasingly unable to control the branch managers who were supposed to report to him. The Bruges branch, managed by Tommaso Portinari, had made enormous loans to Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. Charles was using the money to fund his military ambitions, his wars against France and Switzerland. The loans violated every principle of prudent banking that Giovanni di Bicci had established. This was too large, too concentrated in a single borrower, and extended to a ruler who might well refuse to repay. In January of 1477, Charles the Bold died in battle against the Swiss at Nancy. His body was found days later, half-eaten by wolves, barely recognizable. And the Medici loans died with him. The Bruges branch was devastated, its capital wiped out by debts that would never be recovered. The London branch suffered similar problems, extending excessive credit to the English crown during the Wars of the Roses. When the political situation shifted, the loans went bad. The branch eventually had to be closed, another pillar of the Medici network crumbling. Lorenzo was aware of these problems, but his attention was elsewhere. He attempted some reforms, replacing Sassetti with younger managers, trying to impose stricter controls. But he never gave the bank the sustained focus that Cosimo had provided. The business of banking bored him. The business of culture and politics did not. There were signs that Lorenzo was using Medici bank resources for purposes that blurred the line between family business and public expenditure. Money from the bank helped pay for Lorenzo's diplomatic initiatives, his gifts to allies, his magnificent entertainments. The Medici fortune and the Florentine state budget became entangled in ways that concerned the bank's professional managers. Lorenzo also drew on public funds for private purposes, most notably taking money from a dowry fund that the Florentine government maintained for young women. This was discovered after his death and caused considerable scandal. Lorenzo had always operated in grey areas, as his grandfather had, but he may have pushed further than Cosimo ever did. Yet for all these problems, Lorenzo's Florence remained a marvel. The city was at peace while much of Italy was racked by warfare. Its artists and scholars were producing work that would be celebrated for centuries. Its ruler was a man of genuine brilliance who used his power, on the whole, wisely and well. If the foundations were weakening, the structure still stood, and stood magnificently. Lorenzo's health began to fail in his early 40s. He suffered from the same gout that had crippled his father, along with other ailments that medieval medicine could not diagnose or treat. By 1492 it was clear that he was dying. He passed away on April 8th of that year at his villa in Careggi outside Florence. He was 43 years old. According to tradition, he died with the philosopher Pico della Mirandola and the poet Poliziano at his bedside, surrounded by the intellectual companions who had enriched his life. The fiery preacher Savonarola may also have visited, though accounts of their conversation vary. Lorenzo's death came in the same year that Christopher Columbus sailed west across the Atlantic. The coincidence is symbolic. An old world was passing, and a new one was being born. The Italy that Lorenzo had known, with its delicate balance of competing states and its flowering of Renaissance culture, would soon be swept away by foreign invasions and political upheaval. The Golden Age was ending. Lorenzo left behind a son, Piero, named for his grandfather, but lacking the abilities of either his father or his great-great-grandfather Giovanni. The challenges facing the Medici Bank were severe, and the man now responsible for meeting them was not equal to the task. The decline that had begun under Lorenzo would accelerate rapidly under his heir. But on the day of Lorenzo's death, all of that lay in the future. What the Florentines knew was that they had lost someone irreplaceable, a man who had embodied their city's greatness for more than 2 decades. They called him the Magnificent, and whatever his flaws, he had earned the title. The Medici Bank did not collapse in a single dramatic moment. There was no catastrophic failure, no sudden discovery of fraud that brought everything tumbling down overnight. Instead, the decline was gradual, the result of problems that accumulated over decades, each one manageable in isolation but devastating in combination. By the time Lorenzo the Magnificent died in 1492, the great enterprise his great-grandfather had founded was already grievously weakened. What followed merely completed a process that had been underway for years. To understand the fall, we must return to the roots of decline, tracing the various threads that would eventually unravel the Medici banking empire. The loss of the papal account was perhaps the most significant blow. For nearly a century, the relationship with the papacy had been the crown jewel of Medici banking, the source of enormous profits and unmatched prestige. Giovanni de' Medici had cultivated this relationship, Cosimo had expanded it. But under Lorenzo, it was lost. The quarrel with Pope Sixtus IV began over political matters, disputes about influence in the Romagna region, and the appointment of bishops in Florentine territory. These were serious disagreements, but they might have been resolved through negotiation. Instead, the relationship deteriorated until Sixtus transferred the papal banking business to the Pazzi, the Medici's greatest rivals. This was devastating. The Rome branch, which had long been the most profitable part of the Medici operation, saw its business evaporate almost overnight. The prestige that came from serving the Holy Father passed to competitors, and though the Pazzi conspiracy of 1478 destroyed that family, the papal business did not return to Medici hands. Sixtus remained hostile until his death in 1484, and subsequent popes had other bankers to choose from. The problems in the branch network were equally serious. We've already touched on the disasters at Bruges and London, but they deserve fuller attention, for they reveal a pattern that would have been grimly familiar to any student of Florentine banking history. Tommaso Portinari had managed the Bruges branch for decades. He was a capable man in many ways, well connected in the courts of Burgundy, sophisticated in his understanding of Northern European commerce. But he was also ambitious, eager to expand his operations beyond what prudent banking would allow. The temptation came in the form of Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. Charles was one of the most powerful rulers in Europe, commanding territories that stretched from the Low Countries deep into what is now eastern France. He had grand ambitions to create a kingdom that would rival France itself, and grand ambitions required money. Portinari saw an opportunity. Lending to the Duke of Burgundy would be enormously profitable if the loans were repaid. It would also bring prestige and political connections that could benefit Medici interests throughout Northern Europe. He extended credit to Charles on a scale that far exceeded the Bruges branch's capital, confident that a ruler of such wealth and power would honour his debts. This was precisely the mistake that had destroyed the Bardi and Peruzzi more than a century earlier. Those great banking houses had lent enormous sums to Edward III of England, trusting that a king would repay. When Edward defaulted, they were ruined. Giovanni de' Bicci had understood this lesson. He had counselled caution in lending to rulers, knowing that kings and dukes had the power to simply refuse payment, and there was little a banker could do about it. Portinari either forgot this lesson or believed it did not apply to him. The loans to Charles the Bold grew larger and larger. Reports were sent to Florence expressing concern, but Lorenzo was occupied with other matters, and Sassetti, the general manager, was unable or unwilling to rein in his subordinate. Then, in January of 1477, Charles the Bold met his end on a frozen battlefield outside Nancy. His army was destroyed by Swiss pikemen, and Charles himself was killed, his body so mutilated that it was identified only by his long fingernails and the scars of old wounds. The Burgundian state he had tried to build collapsed with him, divided among his heirs and his enemies, and the Medici loans, they were gone. Whatever Charles might have intended to repay, his successors felt no obligation to honour debts incurred for wars they had not chosen. The Bruges branch was left with enormous losses that wiped out its capital and more. The damage rippled back to Florence, a wound from which the bank would never fully recover. The London branch suffered a similar fate, though the details differed. Here the problem was loans to the English crown during the chaotic period of the Wars of the Roses, the civil conflict between the houses of York and Lancaster. The branch manager had extended credit to Edward IV, hoping to profit from royal favour. When the political winds shifted and debts went unpaid, the branch was crippled. One by one, the branches that Cosimo had built were failing or contracting. The Geneva branch, which had later moved to Lyon, faced its own difficulties. Venice saw reduced operations. The network that had once stretched across Europe was shrinking, pulling back toward its Italian core. Not all the problems were due to bad loans. Some branches suffered from dishonest management, from managers who enriched themselves at the expense of the partnership. The controls that had once kept branch managers accountable had weakened under Lorenzo's distracted leadership. Without close supervision from Florence, some men yielded to temptation. Lorenzo attempted reforms. He replaced Sassetti with younger managers and tried to impose stricter oversight. But these efforts came too late and were applied inconsistently. Lorenzo's attention remained divided among politics, diplomacy, cultural patronage, and his own declining health. The bank never received the sustained focus that might have reversed its decline. By the time of Lorenzo's death in 1492, the Medici Bank was a shadow of what it had been under Cosimo. Several branches had closed entirely. Others operated at reduced capacity. The profits that had once funded magnificent patronage and political dominance had dwindled to a fraction of their former levels. The man who inherited this weakened enterprise was Lorenzo's eldest son, Piero. He was 20 years old, the same age his father had been when he assumed leadership of the family. But where Lorenzo had possessed charm, intelligence, and political instinct in abundance, Piero seemed to have inherited none of these gifts. Contemporary observers were not kind to Piero. They described him as arrogant, impulsive, and lacking in judgment. He was handsome and athletic, skilled at sports and tournaments, but these accomplishments did not translate into the political wisdom that governing Florence required. Where his father had navigated the treacherous waters of Italian politics with consummate skill, Piero seemed determined to make enemies at every turn. The crisis that would destroy Piero and end Medici rule in Florence came from an unexpected direction. In 1494, a French army crossed the Alps and marched into Italy. King Charles VIII of France had inherited a claim to the Kingdom of Naples through a tangled web of royal genealogy. This claim had lain dormant for decades, but Charles was young, ambitious, and eager for military glory. He assembled a powerful army and set out to conquer what he believed was rightfully his. Italian politics were not equipped to handle such an invasion. The peninsula was divided among numerous states, each pursuing its own interests, none strong enough to resist a major European power alone. As Charles's army marched south, Italian rulers scrambled to respond, some seeking alliance with France, others trying to organize resistance, most simply hoping the storm would pass them by. Florence lay directly in Charles's path. The city had to decide whether to resist the French advance or allow the army to pass through peacefully. Either choice carried enormous risks. Piero de' Medici chose to negotiate, travelling to meet King Charles in person, as his father had once travelled to meet King Ferrante of Naples. But where Lorenzo had returned from Naples in triumph, Piero's negotiation was a disaster. Without consulting the Florentine government, without securing any meaningful concessions, Piero surrendered key Florentine fortresses to the French. These were strategic strongholds that protected Florence's access to the sea and its control of surrounding territory. Piero simply handed them over, apparently believing that generosity would win French favour. The Florentines were outraged. When word of Piero's concessions reached the city, the reaction was swift and furious. The government refused to ratify the agreement. Citizens took to the streets, denouncing Piero as a traitor who had bargained away Florence's security without authorization. On November 9th, 1494, Piero attempted to enter the Palazzo della Signoria, the seat of Florentine government, to rally support. He was turned away at the door. Realizing that his position had become untenable, he fled the city with his brothers, barely escaping ahead of mobs that were already gathering to hunt them. The Medici palace was sacked. Citizens and soldiers poured through the magnificent rooms that Cosimo had built, seizing everything of value. The art collection that had taken generations to assemble was scattered. The library with its precious manuscripts was dispersed. The physical embodiment of Medici wealth and culture was stripped bare in hours. Florence declared the Medici rebels and traitors. A price was placed on Piero's head. The family that had dominated the city for 60 years was suddenly outcast, their property confiscated, their very name a cause for condemnation. What remained of the Medici Bank collapsed in the wake of the family's exile. The branches that still operated were closed or seized. Assets were confiscated by the Florentine government and by foreign powers eager to claim what they could. The partnerships that Giovanni de' Medici had so carefully constructed were dissolved. The network that had once moved money across Europe simply ceased to exist. The enterprise that had risen so gradually, built over 3 generations through patient effort and careful management, ended with startling speed. Within months of Piero's flight, the Medici Bank was gone. Florence itself entered a strange period under the influence of Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican friar whose fiery preaching had attracted a devoted following. Savonarola denounced the corruption and worldliness of Florentine society, calling for repentance and moral reform. He saw the French invasion as divine punishment for the city's sins, and the Medici fall as evidence of God's judgment. Under Savonarola's influence, Florence experienced a wave of religious fervour. The most famous expression of this fervour was the bonfire of the Vanities, held in February of 1497. Citizens brought items deemed sinful or frivolous, mirrors and cosmetics, playing cards and dice, books and artwork considered immoral, and burned them in a great pyre in the main square. Some of the art destroyed may have been works that Medici patronage had funded. Savonarola's rule did not last. His attacks on papal corruption brought him into conflict with Pope Alexander VI, who excommunicated him. His political support in Florence eroded as his moral demands grew more extreme. In May of 1498, Savonarola was arrested, tortured, and burned at the stake in the same square where the bonfires of the Vanities had blazed. The Medici would eventually return to Florence. Piero's younger brother Giovanni, who'd been made a cardinal at the age of 13 through Lorenzo's influence, would use his church position to rebuild the family's fortunes. In 1512, with the help of papal and Spanish armies, the Medici reclaimed control of Florence. Giovanni himself would become Pope Leo X in 1513, and another Medici, Giulio, would become Pope Clement VII in 1523. But the Medici who returned were no longer bankers. They were princes and prelates, wielding political and spiritual power rather than commercial power. The bank that Giovanni de' Medici had founded, that Cosimo had expanded, that had financed popes and funded the Renaissance, was gone. The later Medici would rule Florence as dukes, their authority based on military force and dynastic politics, rather than the soft power of wealth and reputation. The fall of the Medici Bank offers lessons that echo through the centuries. It shows how quickly a great enterprise can decline when leadership is distracted or incompetent. It demonstrates the dangers of lending to rulers who can simply refuse to pay. It illustrates the importance of the careful, unglamorous work of management that keeps a complex organization functioning. Giovanni de' Medici had understood these lessons. He had built slowly, avoided excessive risks, and maintained close control over his operations. Cosimo had understood them too, combining political ambition with careful attention to the family business. But Lorenzo, for all his brilliance, had allowed other interests to take priority, and Piero had neither the ability nor the opportunity to reverse the decline. In the end, the Medici Bank lasted almost exactly a century, from Giovanni's founding in 1397 to the collapse in 1494. For much of that time, It was the most important financial institution in Europe, a model of sophisticated banking that influenced the development of finance for generations. Its fall marked the end of an era, the close of a chapter in the history of money and power. Yet even in its fall, the Medici Bank left behind something that transcended commerce. The art and architecture it had funded, the scholars and philosophers it had supported, the ideas it had helped bring into the world, these survived the bank's collapse and survive still. The counting houses are empty now, the ledgers closed forever. But the dome of Florence Cathedral still rises against the Tuscan sky, a monument to what Medici money built. The Medici Bank is gone. Its branches closed more than 5 centuries ago. Its ledgers, those that survived, rest now in archives, studied by historians piecing together the details of medieval commerce. The florins that once flowed through its counting houses have long since been melted down or lost or locked away in museum cases. The partners and managers, the clerks and apprentices have all returned to dust. And yet the Medici legacy endures, visible and tangible, woven into the fabric of our world in ways that most people never consider. What they built with their banking profits outlasted the bank itself by centuries. What they contributed to finance, to politics, to culture, continues to shape our lives today. Let us consider first the purely financial legacy, the contributions the Medici made to the art of banking itself. The branch banking system that Giovanni de' Medici developed and Cosimo perfected was genuinely innovative. The idea of operating a coordinated network of offices across multiple cities and countries, each adapted to local conditions but connected to a central headquarters, was not entirely new. But the Medici refined it to a degree that had rarely been achieved before. The partnership structure they employed was particularly significant. By organizing each branch as a separate legal entity, with its own capital and its own partners, the Medici created a system that limited liability and aligned incentives. This was sophisticated corporate governance centuries before the modern corporation emerged. When a branch failed, the losses were contained rather than spreading through the entire organization. When a branch succeeded, the managers who had contributed to that success shared in the rewards. These structures influenced the development of business organization far beyond Florence. As Italian banking practices spread through Europe in the centuries that followed, the lessons of Medici management travelled with them. The great banking houses of later eras, from the Fuggers of Augsburg to the Rothschilds of Frankfurt and London, would employ similar techniques of decentralized management within centralized control. The Medici contribution to accounting should not be overlooked. Double-entry bookkeeping predated the Medici Bank, having developed in Italian commercial cities over the preceding centuries. But the Medici were masters of the technique, maintaining their books with a precision and sophistication that set standards for their industry. The Libro Segreto, their confidential ledger tracking the overall family fortune, represented an early attempt at consolidated financial reporting, a practice that remains essential to complex business operations today. Beyond specific techniques, the Medici demonstrated something important about the relationship between private enterprise and public good. They showed that a bank could be more than a mere mechanism for extracting profits. It could be an institution that served broader social purposes, that funded art and scholarship, that contributed to the cultural life of its community. This idea that business success carries social responsibilities has echoed through the centuries in various forms, from Victorian philanthropy to modern corporate social responsibility. Of course, The Medici legacy in finance includes cautionary lessons as well as positive models. The decline and fall of the bank illustrates dangers that remain relevant today. The risk of lending to sovereigns, so clearly demonstrated by the Bruges branch disaster, has reappeared in various forms throughout financial history. Governments that borrow heavily can choose to default, and creditors have limited recourse. The Medici learned this lesson from the example of the Bardi and Peruzzi, forgot it, and paid the price. Later generations of bankers would learn and forget the same lesson, from the Latin American debt crises of the 19th century to the sovereign debt problems of our own time. The danger of mixing political power with financial enterprise also remains relevant. The Medici ruled Florence while running its most important bank, a combination that created conflicts of interest and opportunities for abuse. Lorenzo's use of public funds for private purposes, the blurring of lines between family business and state treasury, these are problems that have reappeared whenever political and financial power become too closely intertwined, and the importance of engaged, competent management is a lesson that never goes out of date. The Medici Bank thrived under Giovanni and Cosimo, who gave it their sustained attention and understood its operations in detail. It declined under Lorenzo, whose interests lay elsewhere, and collapsed under Piero, who lacked the ability to manage even if he had possessed the interest. Organizations of all kinds in every era depend on leadership that is both capable and committed. But the Medici legacy extends far beyond finance. The family that lost its bank did not disappear from history. Indeed, some of its greatest achievements came after the counting houses closed. Giovanni di Lorenzo de' Medici, the second son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, had been made a cardinal at the astonishing age of 13. This was a testament to his father's influence with the papacy, a piece of political positioning that would pay extraordinary dividends. Giovanni spent the years of Medici exile cultivating relationships in Rome, building a power base within the church hierarchy. In 1513, Giovanni was elected pope, taking the name Leo X. He was 37 years old, the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, and now the spiritual leader of Catholic Christendom. The Medici had traded the counting house for St. Peter's throne. Leo I's papacy was marked by the same love of culture and lavish spending that had characterized his family in Florence. He was a generous patron of artists and scholars, continuing the Medici tradition in the grandest possible setting. Raphael painted his portrait depicting a plump, intelligent face, the face of a man who loved beauty and pleasure and saw no reason to deny himself either. But Leo's papacy also witnessed the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. In 1517, Martin Luther posted his famous theses challenging the sale of indulgences, the practice by which the Church offered spiritual benefits in exchange for financial contributions. Leo, absorbed in artistic projects and political intrigues, failed to grasp the seriousness of Luther's challenge. The religious unity of Western Christendom, which had endured for 1,000 years, began to fracture during her pontificate. Another Medici would follow Leo to the papal throne. Giulio de' Medici, the illegitimate son of Lorenzo's murdered brother Giuliano, became Pope Clement VII in 1523. His papacy was even more troubled than Leo's, marked by the catastrophic sack of Rome in 1527, when the troops of Emperor Charles V ravaged the Eternal City. Clement spent months besieged in the Castel Sant'Angelo, while imperial soldiers looted churches and brutalized the population. Yet even Clement's troubled reign contributed to the Medici legacy. It was Clement who commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Last Judgment on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel, one of the supreme masterpieces of Western art. The banker's great-nephew, sitting on the throne of St. Peter, continued to patronize the artist that Lorenzo had nurtured as a boy. The Medici connection to European royalty extended beyond the papacy. Catherine de' Medici, the great-great-granddaughter of Lorenzo the Magnificent, married the future King Henry II of France in 1533. She would become one of the most powerful women in European history, serving as queen and then as regent during the tumultuous French Wars of Religion. Catherine brought Florentine sophistication to the French court. Italian cooking, Italian fashion, Italian culture flowed across the Alps in her wake. Some historians credit her with introducing the fork to French dining, a small example of how Medici influence spread far beyond banking and art. The civilization that Florence had nurtured was being exported to the great courts of Europe. In Florence itself, the Medici returned to power in 1512 and would rule the city with interruptions for more than 2 centuries. But they ruled now as princes, not as bankers. In 1569, Cosimo de' Medici was granted the title Grand Duke of Tuscany, formalizing the transformation from merchant family to hereditary aristocracy. The counting houses gave way to palaces, the ledgers to sceptres. The later Medici Grand Dukes continued the family tradition of patronage, though never quite recapturing the creative ferment of the 15th century. They built the Uffizi originally, designed as offices for the Tuscan government, but eventually transformed into one of the world's great art museums. They expanded the Pitti Palace on the south bank of the Arno into an enormous residence. They collected art and antiquities, filling their palaces with treasures. The last Medici ruler was Giangastoni, who died in 1737 without an heir. With him ended the dynasty that had shaped Florence for more than 3 centuries. The Grand Duchy passed to the House of Lorraine, and eventually to a unified Italy. But by then, the physical legacy of the Medici was indelibly stamped on Florence. Walk through the city today, and you walk through spaces they created. The churches of San Lorenzo and San Marco, rebuilt with Medici money. The Medici Palace, still standing on Via Cavour, its courtyard open to visitors who can imagine the Renaissance splendour that once filled these rooms. The dome of the cathedral, funded by the guild that Medici leadership directed, still dominating the skyline as it has for 600 years. The Uffizi Gallery houses the art collection that generations of Medici assembled. Here you can see Botticelli's Primavera and Birth of Venus, paintings commissioned by and for the Medici circle. Here are works by Leonardo and Michelangelo, by Raphael and Titian, gathered over centuries by a family that understood beauty and had the means to acquire it. Millions of tourists visit Florence each year. They come to see the art and architecture, to walk streets that Renaissance geniuses once walked, to feel the presence of history in the warm Tuscan air. Most of them know the name Medici. Few of them think much about the banking operations that made it all possible. Yet the connection is real and direct. The money that paid for Brunelleschi's designs came from bills of exchange and papal deposits. The gold that hired Donatello was earned through foreign exchange profits and carefully managed branches. The wealth that supported Ficino's translations and Botticelli's paintings was accumulated florin by florin in counting houses across Europe. This is perhaps the deepest Medici legacy, the demonstration that commerce and culture can reinforce each other, that money made through business can be transformed into lasting beauty. The Medici were not saints. They were shrewd, ambitious, sometimes ruthless people who pursued wealth and power with single-minded determination. But they used what they gained to create something that transcended mere accumulation. Other wealthy families have existed. Other bankers have built fortunes. But few have left behind a legacy that continues to inspire 5 centuries later. The Medici understood, perhaps instinctively, that money is most meaningful when it is transformed into something beyond itself. A florin spent on a painting becomes immortal in a way that a florin hoarded never can. The ledgers of the Medici Bank are closed. The transactions they recorded, the debits and credits so carefully balanced, have long since ceased to matter. But what those transactions purchased, the beauty they funded, the ideas they supported, the civilization they helped create, this endures. Modern Florence is a living monument to what a family of bankers accomplished. The churches still stand, the paintings still hang on gallery walls, the dome still rises against the sky, visible from miles away, a beacon that has guided travellers home for 600 years. And perhaps that is the final lesson of the Medici story. Wealth is fleeting. Banks rise and fall. Fortunes are made and lost. But beauty, once created, has a permanence that money alone can never achieve. The Medici turned their florins into something that would outlast all the gold in all the vaults of all the banks in the world. They turned money into immortality, and in doing so, they showed us what is possible when commerce serves not just profit, but also the human hunger for beauty and meaning. And so we arrive at the end of our journey, having travelled from the quiet hills of the Mugello to the counting houses of Florence, from modest beginnings to magnificent achievements. We have walked alongside bankers and artists, watched fortunes rise and fall, seen how patience and care can build something lasting, and how neglect can let it slip away. Through it all, one truth has emerged softly. Wealth finds its deepest meaning when transformed into something beyond itself. The Medici understood this. They turned ledgers into libraries, florins into frescoes, commerce into culture. What they bought with their careful profits still enriches us today. You are part of this story too. Every time you save or spend, build or create, you participate in the ancient human endeavour of turning effort into something meaningful. The same impulse that raised the dome of Florence moves through all of us, who dream of leaving something beautiful behind. Now let those dreams grow gentle. The counting house is quiet, the books are closed, the light is fading on the Arno, and Florence sleeps beneath its ancient dome. Breathe slowly. Let your thoughts soften like evening light on terracotta walls. The accounts are balanced, the beauty remains, and you can rest now.